Condemned. In Condemned you play as Ethan Thomas, a serial crime unit agent, who is called in to investigate a murder.
Thomas, I don't got all day here. Let's get a move on.
People are scared. We need to get this one. Follow me. Body's this way. I'm getting too old for this. You gotta crouch to get under the tape.
Just a sec. Strangled by hand. Very forceful.
The gameplay in Condemned is at its best when it switches between gun gameplay and melee gameplay. Otherwise it may become very repetitive and very easy, even on the hardest difficulty. But it's at its best when you switch between those two in one combat sequence. With the challenge, it isn't so much about predictability as it is about timing. I mean, it's more about timing than actually predicting what the enemy will do. I mean, you need to time your hits right, I mean your swings right, you need to time your blocks right. The only downside with that is that that's really everything you can do. You can only block, really. You can't dodge. I mean, yeah, you can quote unquote dodge, but you need to be very far away from the enemy to actually, dodge that shit. And I wouldn't really call it dodging because you're so far away from the enemy. So you can't really dodge it. You only have blocking to actually defend yourself. Of course, you can also kick them, but it doesn't really make such a big difference. You also have a taser, which is also very good because it gives variety and it also gives a tactical approach in the game. But anyway, with the blocking, it might become frustrating sometimes because it's pretty, demanding of when you're supposed to block it, because sometimes it doesn't really make sense if it blocks it and if it doesn't block it. And also some things doesn't seem like it's unblockable. I mean, if you get an instant sequence when a guy is jumping from another side of the room or something, I mean he's ambushing you and it seems like you're pretty far away from him because he only has a stick that's only like, well, it's kind of short, and then you start going backwards because he won't be able to hit you, but well, yeah, he is able to hit you, so it doesn't really make so much sense, this distance between those. It does seem like it matters. It's just about blocking, really, and blocking sometimes the timing doesn't really make any goddamn sense, but so it might become a bit frustrating. But then again, if you're successful with the blocking, you can counter that shit, right away. And that's good. But anyway, with the taser, which is very good, it's very good because if you time it right, it may become an instant kill on the enemy. And you can also take the weapons of the enemies if you're close to them. So it's a bit tactical, if you can call it, sometimes. But like I said, sometimes it might become very frustrating and repetitive because everything is just about timing, really. I mean, the whole challenge is really just about timing. It isn't about anything else, just timing. It isn't about, how much damage it takes, which strategy is the best. I mean, the biggest weapon, the smallest weapon, it's all just falls down to timing, really. And like I said, sometimes the timing doesn't really make so much sense. But anyway, there are a bit of variety of different enemies to fight. It gets better during the course of the game, more different kind of enemies and different kind of strategy. In the beginning of the game, it's really just the same shit over and over again, but during the course of the game, you get new enemies that is faster, more agility and all that shit, and it becomes, different because you need to think differently. The only thing that's kind of frustrating with that is that some enemies have an attack that can, crush two blocks, if you can call it, and they can only do the attack if they don't really have a weapon in their hand. They like headbutt you and something, then you need to break free, and it can become very frustrating at times because you can't block that shit. You need to time your swing right so it kind of cancel, or I don't really know because I haven't really been successful in canceling those attacks. But then again, there aren't really so many enemies that do that. Only one kind of enemies, those big hulking enemies. There are also a bit of variety of different weapons to have. The only problem with that is that you can only hold one of them, and you can't really holster your pistol. It doesn't really make that much sense because in the beginning of the game you actually picked up a gun from your holster. So you can only hold one weapon, melee weapon or firearm. And it becomes even more annoying because when you have a gun you can't really reload them, but the enemies can reload them, which doesn't seem all that balanced, really. I mean, you can also exploit that shit. You can have a gun and then you shoot all your bullets in the gun, then you drop the gun, then you run away, then you let the enemies pick him up, and then when you pick him up, he reloads a new mag in it, and it doesn't seem so much sense really, because sure, if you can't holster the weapon, then you should be able to reload the weapon, right? And if you could holster the weapon, then sure, you can't, reload the weapon. I understand now, but I don't understand this, you can't holster it and you can't reload it. What's the point of that, really? Sure, if you could have one or the other, but not the other, like I said, holster but unable to reload, or unable to holster but able to reload. So it doesn't really make all the sense because of the enemies can reload it. But of course the best part with the game is the criminal investigation things. I mean, when you take away your tools and you need to find, all the blood and something, or take a picture or shit. Sure, it might just be, it's very, automatically, it's, takes out the right equipment you need and everything, but it's variety, something different than just shooting enemies until they're dead and swing things until they're dead. Is something different, than it's good. But the only downside with that is that it isn't really all that many criminal scenes you can investigate. It would be better if it were more about this criminal investigation, but you were a serial crime unit agent, so it doesn't. Well, it would have been better if they had a more criminal scenes, investigation scenes, or whatever you can call it. So the game cycle is a lot of realism, which is very good because of, the atmosphere, which I will talk to later. But like I said, the gameplay is at its best when it switches between gun gameplay and melee gameplay in one, combat sequence. Otherwise, it's a bit, stall and bland. If it's really not all that good, which becomes a big issue in the last level of the game, because in the last level of the game, they forces you to use one. I mean, it forces you to either use melee or use guns, and it took away your taser and really just took away everything you had. So the last level of the game is just not on the same level as the rest of the game gameplay wise. But what about the story then? Well, like I said, the gameplay cycle has a lot of shit on realism, which is very good because of the atmosphere. It's almost the same kind of atmosphere as it was in Fear 1. I mean, this kind of atmosphere is keeps you on the edge, but isn't really scary, but it actually, keeps you on the edge and makes those serious scenes actually matters. But in this game, the horror in the game is actually better than it was in Fear, because of all the scary things the game do to scare you doesn't necessarily mean they're trying to scare you. I mean, for example, let's take Fear. I mean, in Fear they put this, child right in front of you so that you can see the child, and oh no, I'm gonna be scared right now. But in Condemn, you always hear footsteps behind you or shit happening behind you, and you turn around, then you see something roll across the floor. All of a sudden you hear a voice saying something. It's very good because most of that shit you don't really necessarily mean they're trying to scare you. Maybe they're just trying to do something else. It's very good because you can say that the gameplay, the atmosphere keeps you on the edge, and it actually leads to something. It actually leads to something that actually makes the game a bit scary, if you could call it that. And you also have this, with the gameplay, it's not like you fight enemies all the time. It's actually, a sequence between the fighting when you're just, walking, but always on the edge, because all of a sudden an enemy can just jump out and, hit you and attack you and everything, and ambush you. So like I said, the horror in this game is good because the atmosphere keeps you on the edge because of the realism that actually leads to something, horror-ish and scary, but doesn't really necessarily mean it's supposed to be scary. Maybe, what's scary about the bucket, running across the floor? Well, it isn't, necessary. That doesn't mean you're trying to scare, but it becomes, a bit scary because of the atmosphere and everything. Of course, sometimes it might be a couple of jump screams here and there, but most of the time it just revolves around these things that isn't necessarily mean they're trying to scare you. I think they could have done to make it even better was not to throw enemies all the time at you. Actually make some parts that you don't really fight so many enemies, because one, the gameplay isn't really all that good. I mean, it is good when you switch it between, gun gameplay and, melee gameplay, but most of the time, fuck it. You shouldn't throw so many enemies that you just keep this atmosphere going and continue to scare the player with those little things that isn't really necessarily mean it's scary, because eventually, until you fight an enemy, the atmosphere this keeps you on the edge, kind of drops after that, because you fight your enemy, you're seeing, what's lurking around in the house, and now you aren't really that, afraid because you're seeing what it is, because that's also a thing that's hard, because horror is really if you can, make out of what it is you're fighting. If you can't make out what it is you're fighting, then it becomes, a bit better horror, because it all makes, what is it you're fighting? Do you see what is fighting? Do you see what it is? What is it really you're fighting? The problem is that most of the time you can see what it is you're fighting, then it just doesn't become so scary anymore, but sometimes you don't really know what you're fighting, and then it becomes, a bit scary. But in the end with the horror, it's good because the atmosphere keeps you on the edge because of the realistic gameplay, and it actually leads to something, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're trying to scare you. Of course, sometimes it is, they're trying to scare, but most of the time, not really. But also sometimes it's a couple of jump scares here and there, but most of the time it's just this little thing that doesn't really necessarily mean they're trying to scare you. Maybe you're just a big fucking faggot, but maybe you're not. Maybe they're really trying to scare you. But anyway, with the story, it's very good because they actually do a very good job at explaining everything that's going on until the end of the game, because they do explain everything that's going on in the beginning, and they do, mostly explain everything but those mysteries, and most of those mysteries are never really explained, which isn't really all that good because the whole game really revolved around those mysteries, but in the end they never really explained any of them. Of course they say something about them, but it's very vaguely and it doesn't really make so much sense. Well, anyway, during the course of the game, the story gets more and more interesting because it's more mysteries going up and a lot of twists and turns along the way. It's an ordinary story that you can, they give you a couple of stuff to play around with, but in the end, most of the shit they don't really answer or give an answer to anything. They don't really confirm it either. The biggest mystery that is the biggest mystery, however you see on it, it's never really explained. They say something vaguely about it, but in the end they don't really talk about it again. With the characters, there aren't really all that many characters in the game, and not really all of the characters are really, showed of what they are really. They're mostly about, lurking in, old metro station or tunnels or anything really. So none of the characters are actually deep or anything, so it doesn't really matter that much. Sure, the characters are, alright in the aspect of what they're actually showing in the game. You could say that it's bad they don't really have so much big character, because the antagonist and one other dude, the whole story mostly revolves around them, but they don't really explain what there are really in character really. The antagonists are really what it is, an antagonist. It never really explains. Sure, they kind of hint at it in near the end of the game, but it doesn't really lead to anything. They kind of hint near the end of the game that he's something more than just, oh, I'm gonna kill people. There's something more behind, he's the antagonist, but in the end it doesn't really lead to anything. The same with the other character, but it doesn't really lead to anything, because now the character aren't really all that deployed really. With the main character, Ethan Thomas, not so much is explained really. The only thing that's explained doesn't really make the character better, just the mystery in the story better. But like I said, the character doesn't really have such a big, deal in the story, but you could say it's a big deal because of the antagonist and the other character actually hinting near the end there's something much bigger than those simple characters, but it doesn't lead to anything, like most of the mystery do. Exactly like the mystery, it doesn't really lead to anything in the end. But in conclusion then, like I said in the gameplay is at its best when it switches between gun gameplay and melee gameplay. But in the last level of the game, it takes that shit away. It forces the player to use melee or use guns. It takes away the taser, it takes away mostly everything, the criminal, forensic tools and all that shit, or whatever you call that. And it just becomes, this, swinging them until they're dead. And also this melee gameplay that it's just about timing, really. Everything is about timing, but the time doesn't really make so much sense. And when you're shooting with the guns, well, it's just shooting really, aim for the head, then you can't really reload it, you can't holster a pistol, or you can't reload and not holster. It isn't really all that good when it's, individually it's not that good, but together when you're switching them in one combat sequence, it's very good and at its best. But in the last level of the game, it just isn't on the same level as it was during the rest of the game, gameplay wise. With the story, it's, it gets better during the course of the game, more mysteries and everything, and characters and blah blah blah. But in the end, most of the mysteries are never really answered or solved. None of the character that didn't really have such a big deal in the story actually kind of hints that they have a big deal in the story, but it doesn't lead to anything. So that is pretty damn bad. With the gameplay again, it's the best part with the game is actually when you're actually investigating the crimes and scenes and everything. But the problem with that is there isn't really all that many murder scenes that you investigate. But like I said, with the horror sequences, it's very good because of the atmosphere is very good because of the realistic gameplay, and it's because of that it always keeps you on the edge, and it actually leads to something. But all the things that it actually leads to doesn't necessarily mean they're trying to scare you, so that's very good. But in the end, because of the last level just being not on the same level gameplay wise, and most of the mysteries that actually was a driving force of the game doesn't really lead to anything, and the characters actually hinting in the end they're actually a big deal of the story. They are a big fucking thing going on behind those characters. The meaning of what he was actually doing is a lot bigger, but it's never really explained. Because of that, I would say that Condemned, it's still a great game. It's not fantastic. I mean, I would call it fantastic if it wasn't like that. But now, because of, the gameplay in the last level, and the characters not leading to anything, and the mystery not really being solved, then Condemned, it's still a great game. It's not fantastic anymore. It was fantastic if it continued the way it did before, not with the last level, and actually, solving the mysteries, and not really putting so much emphasis on the characters like they did in the near end of the game, which doesn't really make so much sense because the character wasn't really all that deployed. Now all of a sudden they are a big thing, and it didn't lead to anything. But they didn't do it. They actually, they didn't solve the mystery. The character became a big thing, but during the majority of the game there wasn't a big thing, but all of a sudden they were a big thing, but it didn't lead to anything. And the last level is being not on the same levels as the rest of the game gameplay wise. Then I would say Condemned, it's still a great game. So in the end, Condemned Criminal Orion, it's a great game.